you like your instruments to look all vintagey, but have the advantage of being a modern instrument? Well, if so, this is the video for you, because I have got 4 of the best examples of instruments that exactly fit that criteria, representing 4 different brands. I'm going to be unpacking them in the usual way, looking at the tone, looking at the ergonomics, looking at the playability. So let's get cracking and see what these instruments are going to offer us. So the 4 models in question today are the Eastman 52nd Street Alto, the Atlantic London The Duke, the unlacquered model. I've got here the Signature Custom Raw model, and behind me I have a P. Moriat 67R Influence model, which is the most expensive of the 4 in question. And the thing that interests me about the 4 models I have here is that these are largely the flagship models of the different brands represented. So it's interesting that we don't actually have here a Selmer, a Yanagisawa, or a Yamaha. And I suppose in that sense, we associate these big 3, if you like, with more producing kind of shiny finished saxophones. So it's interesting that these other 4 brands that produce excellent saxophones, their USP, if you like, is to produce a saxophone that is just a little bit different. And so that is the subject matter that we will get into today. So yeah, let's give these guys a blow and check them out. So let's talk about the ergonomics first of all. On the Eastman, generally speaking, I really enjoyed the ergonomics. It's got a great natural key layout. Everything feels very comfortable indeed. And in terms of criticisms, I don't really have much to offer, other than just a couple of minor gripes really. On the right-hand thumb rest here, sometimes I have an issue with the curvature of this piece here. And again, this is a personal thing. It depends on your hand position. We all play differently. But for me, it just slightly digs in on the right-hand thumb there. So yes, you can adjust the angle here, which may help a little bit, but that's just one little observation for me there. I always like to look at the table keys because I do find that with some saxophones, the manufacturers don't quite get it right. You end up getting stuck with the little pin key in certain areas, often on the B key. But actually, this feels really great to me. Nice and flush. Everything sits flush here, if you can see that. So that works for me very nicely. The only thing I would say is there's a little bit more of a gap between the G key and the G sharp than I would like in my perfect ideal world. But otherwise, everything feels great. The shaping of the palm keys feels fantastic. And that links on nicely to the next saxophone, which you heard in sequence there, which is the Atlantic, which feels very similar to me in terms of its ergonomics. The layout feeling absolutely great. And actually, a few areas are tidied up for me with the Atlantic over and above the Eastman, in the sense that I just mentioned that gap between the G sharp key and the G key, and it is a little closer. So for me, that feels just perfect. I'm not having to stretch out down there like I do a little bit on the Eastman. For me, that's just really natural, just moving to the G sharp, and then in a sort of similar way, it just spreads nicely through the table keys. So that is all sitting perfectly for me. One interesting feature to mention on the Atlantic, whilst I'm looking at it here, is the fact that it has adjustable palm keys. For me, adjustable palm keys is a funny thing, because I always find that the most important thing about palm keys is just having the right design in the first place, because we can't adjust them to come out this way, right? We're actually only swiveling in this direction, which is kind of a neat thing to have in terms of just those final few tweaks to make it exactly fit our palm nicely, which I suppose you could do with this. But for me, it's sitting great as it is anyway. I don't think I'd actually want to adjust these palm keys, even though there is the option to do so, which is great. Also on this one, the general layout is great as mentioned, but with the table keys, I find them particularly good, nice and flush, and the movement is very easy around this area here. Otherwise, all very comfortable, everything in the right hand laid out very nicely. On to the Signature Custom, and even though the ergonomics in general are good, I did have a bit of an issue with the table keys. I mentioned at the start there, that slight issue you can have when you get stuck. And just as I'm playing the low B key here, no problem playing the B, but then you try and maneuver onto the B flat, and there's a bit of a shelf there, so you find yourself sort of trying to move up this step to get onto the B flat. So it's a little bit cumbersome for me. I prefer the two keys to just be on a level, and just to be able to slide from the B to B flat, which is a notoriously difficult slide on the saxophone anyway. So yeah, not as great on this one as the first two mentioned there. But otherwise, everything is laid out very nicely, and the action feels very smooth. Sort of no further complaints there. The right-hand thumb rest feels pretty good to me. I mean, these are all high-quality saxophones, and the ergonomics have been very well thought out by the manufacturers in general. So I'm finding overall everything to be quite enjoyable, but just a few little comments to make here or there. Going on to the final one, the P. Moriat. Again, overall, generally speaking, very comfortable, but something to point out here in terms of the ergonomics, and something that sets this instrument apart from the others, and actually from other P. Moriats in general, are these nickel silver key touches, which does add a lot to the expense of this instrument. And certainly it has an effect on the feel under the fingers. I really like it, actually. There's almost a slightly tactile feeling. So it feels great, it feels really nimble. I love that. In theory, the nickel silver key touches adds a certain resonance to the tone. We can't necessarily prove that in today's video, because you need to be scientific about that sort of thing. But it's worth pointing out that this instrument has these key touches, and it does add a fair bit to the price tag. So generally speaking, left and right hand action and stacks, sitting in a nice comfortable position, feels good under the fingers. I'd only say slightly on the palm keys for me that this high F key just protruding a little bit more than I would like. So I find my hand is just set out slightly further this way. Again, I always say this, you can adjust to these things. Unless you've got a serious problem, like let's say you have really small hands and this is protruding quite a lot, then that may be more of a problem if you're trying to play in a comfortable way without sort of straining the hand at all. I've got relatively large hands, so for me, that's not a problem. It's just an observation on this instrument in comparison to the other 3 that I have tried. But otherwise, overall, feels great. And actually, I've mentioned all other 3, so I'll mention it on this one here. Table keys, feels great. I can slide very nicely from the B to the B flat on this one. So very comfortable arrangement here and set in a nice position in relationship to the left hand stack. Okay, on to the sound. So the first instrument I started with, again, was the Eastman 52nd Street. And for me, this has a lovely, warm, centered sound with a lot of core to the sound, a very defined core. And I do like a defined core in my sound. And actually, just talking about all 4 in general for a moment, one of the things that interests me in these particular 4 is, and actually the brands in general, is that they all have really interesting sounds. And hopefully you enjoyed that in my demos there, but certainly as a saxophonist playing the 4 of them, I really do enjoy playing these just from the sound point of view, because I find that they're also interesting and they all have their idiosyncrasies and differences. As mentioned with this one, it's got that lovely heart to the sound and a very obvious defined core to it. And just lots that you can do with it as well. You know, when you push it, there's a certain projection and brightness there. The sound opens up and gives a bit more of a contemporary vibe, which I love. And I suppose that leads me on to the Atlantic. I'm finding a sort of similar tonal characteristic on the Atlantic to the Eastman there in terms of that lovely heart to the sound and that defined core. And when you push it, yes, you get that extra element of brightness, which you do, generally speaking, on all saxophones, but sometimes it's more defined on one sax over another. And I find, particularly on the Atlantic, it really does that very well. When you really push air through it, you do get a big response. The sound goes brighter without being harsh or thin. It just has that natural weight behind the sound, even, you know, when you're pushing some serious decibels of air, or sound rather, through the instrument. So yeah, I love it from that point of view. And then again, when you drop back, it's got a lovely, lush, rich, deep sound at the sort of lower end of the air pressure spectrum. So beautiful from that point of view. Onto the third sax, interesting with the Sig Custom, in that, again, it shares the lovely, luscious, sort of warm, deep tones that we're talking about with all of these instruments. But for me, this one doesn't have the same core that I'm getting, particularly on these two here, the Eastman and the Atlantic. The sound is a little bit, it's almost like it has a featheriness around the side of the sound. So less of a defined core and slightly more spread, I suppose you might say, but very warm. And at the same time, when you push it, it has got that ability to brighten up and bring a contemporary edge to the sound, which is great. You know, if you're looking for the vintage inspired look, which obviously we've got with all of these instruments, but you want it to sound like a modern sax that has the flexibility to do these, to play modern music and really cut through. We are getting that with all the instruments thus far. So moving on to the fourth one, in terms of the sound, the P Moriat. And for me, this one departs very slightly from the direction just discussed, in that it really has it's a slightly darker and more earthy sound, I suppose, than the others. It doesn't, for me, I mean, it's a lovely, big, luscious sound. It doesn't, for me, have that same sort of obvious core and the ability to really brighten up and sort of pack with a punch like we had with the others. It just naturally has this very big, earthy, hearty sound, lovely, luscious, big tone. So if that's a sound you're looking for, that proper vintagey, warm sound, you really do get it with the influence. So yeah, love it in terms of that tone. Just in terms of that absolute projection and really pushing the sound with more of a point to it and a front. Perhaps this isn't the sax, and the others are, because they really do that very well. But overall, all four of them just have fantastic tones. I mean, P. Moriat's motto is go for the sound. And you can see why they say that, because they do produce instruments with a lovely tone. And this one here is no exception. So that gives you a bit of an overview in terms of the key things that we're looking for with ergonomics and with the tone. So let's maybe just spare a moment to look at these saxophones in terms of the aesthetics and, you know, other aspects of their design and what have you. I have here an Atlantic in front of me, and what's lovely about this new brand is that it's just a little bit different. The aesthetics are unique, and so if this side of things is important to you, besides, you know, the aspects of the saxophone being a tool, which of course it is, it needs to perform in the right way, and that's what I've just discussed. But onto looks, this is a cracker of a looker. And of course, it's very subjective. Perhaps not everyone loves it, but I think a lot of people do. And just picking out a couple of features here whilst I've got this on my left leg, we've got the rolled tone holes throughout this model here. And actually, it shares that in common with the Eastman. Whether I can bring that into the conversation now in terms of, is this having an influence on the sound? And a similar thing really with the extra large flared bell on this one here and on the Eastman and also on the P. Moriat. It's hard to say. You need to do scientific tests on that stuff to really prove it. But certainly, I like to think that these features do sort of add up. I think it's incremental in terms of their effect on the tone. You certainly feel this big blossoming sound when you're playing the low notes on this instrument and the other ones with the large flared bell. So I'd like to think that it does make a difference. And even if it's only a small difference, it certainly looks absolutely fantastic. So just in general, I mean, some of the things to consider if you're looking at these instruments and trying to make a decision as to which way to go. First of all, I suppose one of the obvious things to say is, let's talk about the price. Three of them are in the ballpark at the moment, just under the £3,000 mark. I'm talking in GBP here. So they're similar sort of price, but the one that is in a slightly different price category is the P. Moriat. And I should say that this one here isn't perhaps their standard flagship model, which would be the regular 67R. or 66R if it's a tenor version. The thing that makes this more expensive, as mentioned before, is the nickel silver key touches. It actually adds a lot of expense to this instrument. But if you just reduce it down to their regular model, which sounds very similar really to this one, then it is in a similar sort of price area. So that's the only thing to mention in terms of these 4 specific instruments and their prices. But as to how to choose a model, I mean, ideally, if you can come down to the store and try them, we all know that is the perfect solution because it's a very subjective thing. But otherwise, what I'm finding, the general trends of these saxophones, we've got a sort of almost a slight divide, I suppose, between the directions of the sound and response. So with the Atlantic and the Eastman, I find that they've got that lovely core to the sound, which, as mentioned before, really opens up into something more powerful. So it kind of gives these instruments the ability to be able to play in a multitude of styles. They're very flexible. You know, you can play in a traditional jazz setting and everything that entails. But then when you really push it, they give out a brighter, more contemporary sound. So you can take that in whatever direction you want. So, consider that when you're thinking about the use for these instruments. With the P. Moriat, as mentioned before, I found the sound really warm and really luscious. So suiting, all jazz styles and everything related to that. Didn't quite have that same punch and brightness as the others. So again, just consider that when we're thinking about the playing style that you might be playing in and your eventual use for this instrument. And then the SIG Custom, perhaps maybe something in between in terms of those characteristics just described. So that's it from me. I really have loved playing on all 4. I think they're all great instruments. I'd be happy playing on any of them in most musical settings, to be honest with you. So really, I'll leave it to you guys. I've given you everything I can give in terms of my feelings on these 4 fabulous instruments. So that's it from me, and I shall see you on another day.